The driver, sentenced to 4 years in prison for killing a cyclist, will not be granted community corrections.
Every legend has an origin point, a single small moment that seems ordinary until you look back and realize it was the beginning of everything. For Magnus White, that moment came on a Strider bike before he could even read in the quiet mountain town of Boulder, Colorado. He was 2 years old, wobbling down a driveway, refusing to be caught. By the time most children are learning to ride with training wheels still attached, Magnus was already racing. He started competing at 8 years old, and by 10, he was turning heads at the regional level. There was something different about him, not just raw talent, but a hunger. He trained with Boulder Junior Cycling, a program that has produced some of America's most promising young riders, and he absorbed everything: the discipline, the pain tolerance, the strategy of reading a race before it happens. Boulder itself seemed built for a boy like Magnus. Nestled against the Rocky Mountains, with the Flatirons rising like stone sentinels over the city, it is one of the cycling capitals of the United States, a place where road bikes and mountain bikes are as common on the streets as cars. Magnus grew up breathing that culture. His parents, Michael and Jill White, watched their son fall in love with something they could barely have predicted would consume and define his short life. By his mid-teens, Magnus wasn't just a local talent anymore. He was a name. In 2021, he won the USA Cycling Junior 17-18 Cyclocross National Championship, a title that placed him among the best young riders in the entire country. He represented the United States on the international stage, competing in the 2022 UCI Cyclocross World Championships in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and again in January 2023 in Hoogerheide in the Netherlands, 2 world championships before the age of 17. For most cyclists, one is a career highlight. For Magnus, it was simply the beginning. He wasn't a one-discipline athlete either. He moved fluidly between cyclocross, road racing, and mountain biking, a versatility that coaches prize because it demands a rider be tactically sharp in 3 completely different environments. He had earned a spot on USA Cycling's junior men's national team, an honor reserved for a small handful of the country's most promising young riders. But those who knew him insist the trophies were never the whole story. Magnus was, by every account, a warm and easy presence, the kind of teenager who filled a room with laughter rather than demanding attention in it. He was also an avid skier and a serious, ambitious student, someone who planned to attend business school and had already arranged to graduate high school a semester early so he could dedicate himself fully to international competition. He was building 2 futures at once, one on 2 wheels and one behind a desk, refusing to let either one crowd out the other. In the summer of 2023, everything was converging. Magnus had qualified for the Junior Men's Mountain Bike Cross Country World Championships, scheduled to take place in Glasgow, Scotland, in early August. It would have been his 3rd World Championship appearance, an extraordinary achievement for a 17-year-old, and a clear signal that his rise toward the senior ranks, and perhaps one day the Olympic stage, was no longer a question of if, but when. To get there, he needed to keep training. Every morning that July, while Boulder was still cool and quiet, Magnus laced up, checked his bike, and rode. It was routine. It was normal. It was the same road he had ridden 100 times before. No one in his family, his team, or his town had any reason to believe that a training ride on a Sunday morning in late July would be any different from the thousands that came before it. But 3 years later, a Colorado courtroom would spend a week untangling exactly what happened on that stretch of highway and exposing a chain of decisions, lies, and institutional failures that turned a young man's routine ride into the most devastating story in American cycling in a generation. This is that story, not as headlines told it in the panicked hours after the crash, but as the full record, assembled piece by piece over 3 years of investigation, arrest, delay, trial, and reckoning, finally reveals it. Sunday, July 29th, 2023, started like any other training day. Magnus White was 72 hours from boarding a flight to Scotland. 72 hours from the moment he would pull on a Team USA jersey and line up against the best junior mountain bikers on earth. This ride, like so many before it, was about fine-tuning, legs, lungs, focus, nothing more. He headed out from his family's home in Boulder onto State Highway 119, also known locally as the Diagonal Highway, a route cyclists in the area know well. It has a paved shoulder, wide enough in theory to separate cyclists from traffic, narrow enough in practice that a single lapse behind the wheel of a car can close that gap in an instant. Magnus was wearing his helmet. He was riding where he was supposed to be riding, on the shoulder, not the road itself. He was doing everything right. At the same time, a 23-year-old woman named Yeva Smilyanska was driving a Toyota Matrix along the same stretch of highway. What investigators would spend the next 20 months trying to establish was simple to ask and agonizingly difficult to prove. Why did her car drift out of its lane and into the shoulder where Magnus was riding? The impact happened from behind. Magnus never saw it coming. He was struck and launched from his bike, thrown with a force that left no room for the kind of near miss that so many cyclists walk away from with only a scare and a bent wheel. Emergency responders arrived to a scene that Boulder County would later describe through law enforcement documents in stark and clinical terms. But for the family racing to the hospital, no clinical language could soften what was happening. Magnus was rushed to the hospital. Despite the severity of his injuries, and despite everything medical teams could do, he was pronounced dead, just 15 minutes from the home he had grown up in. Just 3 days from the trip that was supposed to mark another milestone in a career that had barely begun. At the scene, Smilyanska told officers she had been drinking. It was a detail that should have triggered an immediate, formal sobriety test. A blood alcohol check that could have settled, definitively and on day one, one of the central questions that would haunt this case for years. It did not happen. No test was administered. That single missing step, a basic routine procedure in a fatal crash investigation, would become one of the most contested and consequential failures in the entire case. One that the White family would later describe publicly as a systemic breakdown by the very officials responsible for handling the truth. In the immediate aftermath, the facts available to the public were sparse and painful in their simplicity. A rising cycling star struck from behind on a training ride, killed instantly on a road he had ridden countless times. USA Cycling issued a statement within a day, calling him a rising star and extending condolences to his family, teammates, and the broader Boulder community. The phrase that would follow his name in headlines and tributes for years afterward was born in that statement: "We ride for Magnus." Michael and Jill White, Magnus's parents, released their own words soon after, raw, aching, and specific to the boy they had raised, not the athlete the headlines had already begun to describe. They spoke of his laughter, his devotion to family and friends, and a smile that they said could light up any room he walked into. It was the kind of statement that made clear, before Magnus White was a champion, he was simply their son. What no one outside the investigation knew yet, what would take a state patrol probe, a 5-month wait, an arrest, and eventually a jury trial to reveal, was how much of what actually happened on Highway 119 that morning was still hidden, and how long the truth would take to surface. Grief, in a place like Boulder, does not stay behind closed doors for long. Cycling is not a hobby here. It is closer to a civic identity, woven into the roads, the trails, the local shops, the weekend rituals of entire families. When word spread that Magnus White had been killed, the reaction was immediate and communal. Tributes poured in from across the sport. Teammates who had shared start lines with him in Arkansas and the Netherlands spoke of a rider who pushed them to be better and who somehow made brutal training blocks feel less lonely. Coaches who had watched him grow from a promising 10-year-old into a national champion described a kind of talent that comes along rarely. Not just physical gifts, but the tactical intelligence and discipline to use them. National and international media picked up the story quickly. Outlets that rarely covered junior cycling, accustomed to writing about the sport only when the Tour de France rolls around each summer, found themselves reporting on a 17-year-old from Colorado because his story carried a universal, unbearable weight. A young person doing everything right, following every rule, wearing every piece of safety equipment, killed anyway by a danger entirely outside his control. A ghost bike appeared along Highway 119. A bicycle painted white and placed at the site of a cycling fatality. A quiet but powerful tradition among cycling communities, to mark where a rider's life ended, and to remind drivers passing by that a person, not a statistic, died there. It became a site of pilgrimage. Riders slowed as they passed. Some stopped to leave flowers, notes, small mementos. Roughly a year after his death, thousands of cyclists gathered at the University of Colorado's campus for what organizers called a ride, not a race, a memorial ride that traced a route toward the diagonal highway and back, passing the ghost bike that marked the spot where Magnus was killed. It wasn't about speed or competition. It was about presence, about showing, in the most literal way a cycling community knows how, that Magnus had not been forgotten, and that his death had changed how an entire town thought about the roads it rode every day. Out of that grief, the White family made a decision that would come to define much of what followed. They didn't just mourn. They organized. They founded a nonprofit called the White Line, built specifically to advocate for cyclist safety, pushing for greater physical separation between vehicle traffic and vulnerable road users, lobbying Colorado lawmakers for stronger penalties in vehicular homicide cases, and appealing at the national level to the Federal Highway Safety Administration to expand automatic emergency braking standards so that the technology would specifically detect cyclists and motorcyclists, not just other cars. It was, in effect, an attempt to make sure that if the system had failed to protect Magnus, it would not fail the next rider in the same way. But even as tributes multiplied and the advocacy work began, one enormous unresolved question sat underneath all of it. No one had yet been formally charged. The driver who struck and killed Magnus White was still, in the eyes of the legal system, uncharged and unaccountable, and the investigation into exactly what had happened behind the wheel of that Toyota Matrix was only beginning to unfold, slowly, and, as the family would later argue, far too imperfectly. For the White family, the weeks after Magnus's death brought a second, quieter kind of pain, the agony of waiting. A criminal investigation had opened, led by the Colorado State Patrol. But as summer turned to fall and fall turned toward winter, there was no arrest, no charge, no clear public accounting of what investigators believed had happened on Highway 119. This is where the case's most consequential wound was inflicted, not at the moment of impact, but in the hours immediately after it. At the scene, Smiljanska had told responding officers that she had been drinking prior to the crash. Under standard protocol in a fatal collision, that kind of admission should have triggered an immediate blood alcohol test. It did not happen. No sobriety test was conducted. No blood draw was taken. By the time investigators circled back to examine the question of impairment, the biological evidence that could have settled it with scientific certainty had already disappeared from her system, gone with the passing hours. It was an investigative failure, with consequences that would ripple for years, turning what might have been a straightforward toxicology finding into a matter that instead had to be reconstructed through witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and, eventually, courtroom argument over exactly how much Smiljanska had had to drink and when. Investigators pursued another theory as the months wore on: fatigue. The arrest affidavit that would eventually be filed alleged that Smiljanska had been driving while sleep-deprived and had fallen asleep at the wheel in the moments before striking Magnus, her car drifting out of its lane and onto the shoulder where he was riding. It was this theory, more than any other, that the Boulder County District Attorney's Office would ultimately build its case around. Smiljanska, for her part, would later deny falling asleep entirely. Her account, delivered through her defense team, pointed instead to a mechanical explanation: a steering malfunction that she said caused the car to leave its lane, framing the entire tragedy as an unavoidable accident, rather than the product of any choice she had made behind the wheel. Nearly 5 months passed, 5 months in which the White family had no formal charges to point to, no court date, no legal process moving forward, only continued advocacy work, continued grief, and continued questions about why an investigation into a fatal witness collision was taking so long to produce an arrest. During those months, another detail entered the public conversation that would later prove to be false, but which shaped early sympathy narratives around the case. Reports characterizing Smiljanska as a Ukrainian refugee. It was a detail that traveled widely in early coverage and would later be directly disputed in court. one of several assertions that the trial itself would ultimately have to sort fact from fiction on, nearly 2 years after the crash. By December 2023, investigators had finally built what they believed was a case strong enough to act on. The long silence was about to end, but for the White family, the arrest that followed would prove to be only the beginning of an even longer fight for accountability, one that would stretch across another 1.5 years of legal delays before a single witness ever took the stand. On Tuesday, December 12, 2023, nearly 1.5 years before most Americans would hear Magnus White's name in the context of a trial, the Longmont Police Department arrested Ewa Smiljanska. She was transported to the Boulder County Jail and formally charged with reckless vehicular homicide, a Class 4 felony in Colorado carrying a potential sentence of 2 to 6 years in prison and fines reaching as high as $500,000. The following day, Smiljanska appeared in court for the first time, assisted by a Russian-speaking interpreter. Boulder County District Attorney Michael Dougherty addressed the case publicly, describing Magnus White's life as having been cut tragically short and calling his death devastating for his family, his friends, and the broader cycling community that had rallied around them for nearly half a year by that point. For the White family, the arrest brought a fragile, complicated kind of relief. Not closure, not justice, but at least forward motion after months of institutional silence. Through the White Line, the nonprofit they had built in Magnus's memory, they released a statement that reframed the tragedy in terms far larger than one crash on one highway. They argued that Magnus's death had been preventable, and that it underscored a responsibility every single driver carries every time they get behind the wheel, a responsibility they said had been catastrophically failed on the morning of July 29th. They wrote about the basic, almost invisible trust that underpins every shared road in the country, that when you get in your car, get on your bike, or walk down a sidewalk, you are trusting that the other people around you will not, through carelessness or recklessness, take your life. That trust for Magnus had been broken in an instant. Public details about the driver herself began to surface and circulate. She was 23 at the time of her arrest, young herself, though 6 years older than the boy she had struck. Early reporting described her inaccurately as a Ukrainian refugee, a detail that added an additional layer of public sympathy and complexity to a case that was already emotionally fraught on every side. That characterization would later be directly contradicted in court, becoming one of several narratives the trial would have to correct rather than confirm. The arrest affidavit itself detailed investigators' central theory that Smiljanska had been operating her vehicle while sleep-deprived and had fallen asleep at the wheel in the moments before drifting into the shoulder and striking Magnus. It was a theory built from witness accounts, timeline reconstruction, and physical evidence at the scene, but notably, not from any blood alcohol or toxicology result, since none had ever been collected. Smiljanska denied the state's theory. Through her attorneys, she maintained that the crash resulted from a steering malfunction in her vehicle, not from fatigue, and certainly not from anything resembling recklessness. It was a defense that set the stage for what would become the central conflict of the eventual trial. Not whether she had struck and killed Magnus White, that was never seriously in dispute, but whether her conduct that morning met the legal threshold of reckless behavior, or whether it was, as her defense would argue, simply a tragic accident. With formal charges finally filed, the case moved into the slow, grinding machinery of the American criminal justice system, a process that, for the White family, was about to prove far more painful and far more prolonged than they could have anticipated. Grief can isolate a family, or it can radicalize their sense of purpose. For Michael and Jill White, it became unmistakably the latter. In the aftermath of the arrest, as the legal process settled into the slow rhythm of pretrial hearings and procedural delays, the Whites did not retreat from public life. They stepped further into it, turning their son's death into the foundation of a sustained advocacy campaign that reached far beyond Boulder County. The White Line, the nonprofit organization they founded in Magnus's name, became the vehicle for that work. Its mission crystallized around 3 concrete goals. First, at the infrastructure level, creating genuine physical separation between vehicle traffic and vulnerable road users like cyclists, rather than relying on a painted line and a few feet of shoulder to keep people alive. Second, at the state level, pushing Colorado legislators to strengthen penalties for vehicular homicide, arguing that the existing framework did not reflect the true weight of a life lost to reckless driving. Third, at the federal level, petitioning the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to expand automatic emergency braking requirements so the technology would be specifically designed to detect and respond to cyclists and motorcyclists, not only other automobiles. It was methodical, policy-driven grief, the kind that channels devastation into legislative language and public comment periods rather than letting it dissipate into private mourning alone. The family invited supporters to sign formal letters backing each of the three initiatives, treating Magnus's story not just as a tragedy to be remembered, but as a case study that could, if used correctly, prevent the next one. At the same time, the Whites pursued a separate track of accountability, a civil wrongful death lawsuit filed against Smiljanska, running parallel to the criminal case. It was a decision that reflected something many families in their position come to understand, that a criminal conviction, even if achieved, addresses only one dimension of the harm done, and that civil action can pursue accountability the criminal system either cannot or will not fully deliver. Throughout 2024, as the criminal case against Smiljanska wound through a series of delays, the Whites remained visible in the Boulder community and in national conversations about cyclist safety. They spoke at memorial rides, they engaged with reporters, they pushed back, publicly and repeatedly, against the idea that Magnus's death could be filed away as an unfortunate but unavoidable accident. For them, the distinction mattered enormously. An accident implies nothing could have been done differently. What they were arguing, increasingly and with growing evidence behind them, was that this had been preventable, a product of specific choices and specific institutional failures, not simply terrible luck. It was a stance that would be tested and ultimately validated when the case that had already stretched well past its first anniversary and would soon stretch into a second, finally reached a courtroom, where facts that had lingered in dispute for a year and a half would finally be argued in front of a jury. Justice in the American legal system rarely moves at the pace grief demands. For the White family, 2024 became a study in that gap, a year defined less by resolution than by repeated postponement. In March 2024, prosecutors offered Smiljanska a plea deal, an arrangement that would have resolved the case without a trial, likely with a negotiated sentence in exchange for an admission of guilt. Smiljanska rejected it. It was her right, and by rejecting it, she set the case on a course toward a full jury trial, rather than a quieter, faster resolution. For the White family, the rejection meant the wait was not over. It was, in some ways, just beginning in earnest. Around the same time, Smiljanska's defense attorney requested a delay in proceedings, and the request was granted, pushing the timeline further into the year. It was the kind of procedural maneuvering that is entirely ordinary in criminal defense practice. Attorneys routinely need additional time to review evidence, consult experts, and prepare arguments. But for a family already approaching a year without resolution, each delay compounded an already exhausting wait. Then, in December 2024, right around the 1.5-year anniversary of Magnus's death, the case was delayed a second time. What had initially seemed, in the weeks after the December 2023 arrest, like a case moving toward accountability, now stretched toward its own second anniversary without a jury ever having heard a single piece of testimony. Throughout this period, Smiljanska maintained her not guilty plea, formally entered in May 2024. Her defense strategy, which would only become fully clear once the trial began the following spring, was not built around denying that she struck and killed Magnus White. That fact was never seriously contested by either side. Instead, her attorneys prepared to argue something narrower and, in some ways, more legally technical: that whatever happened on Highway 119 that morning did not rise to the level of reckless conduct required for a vehicular homicide conviction, but instead reflected, at most, careless driving, a lesser charge with far lighter consequences. For the White family, each delay was not simply an inconvenience. It was an extension of uncertainty about whether the full truth of what happened that July morning would ever be tested in open court, or whether institutional friction and legal maneuvering might quietly wear the case down before it ever reached a jury. By early 2025, nearly 20 months after Magnus's death, a trial date was finally locked in. The case would go before a Boulder County jury at the end of March. And with it, for the first time, the White family, the public, and the cycling world that had rallied around Magnus's memory for a year and a half would finally hear, under oath and cross-examination, the full account of what happened and what didn't happen on the morning that changed all of their lives. The trial opened on Monday, March 31st, 2025 at the Boulder County Justice Center, nearly 20 months to the day since Magnus White was struck and killed on Highway 119, for a case that had been defined for so long by delay, procedural maneuvering, and institutional silence. The beginning of testimony marked the first moment the full, contested account of that July morning would be laid out in public under oath, subject to cross-examination from both sides. The central legal question the jury would have to answer was, in one sense, narrow. Did Yeva Smiljanska's conduct behind the wheel rise to the level of reckless driving required for a conviction of vehicular homicide, or did it amount only to the lesser offense of careless driving? But answering that narrow legal question required the jury and the public watching the case unfold to reconstruct, in granular detail, exactly what Smiljanska had done in the hours before the crash. Defense attorney Timur Kishinevsky did not dispute the basic facts of the collision itself. In his closing argument, he would tell the jury directly that very few facts in the case were actually in dispute, an acknowledgement that reframed the entire trial around a single question of legal characterization rather than a whodunit. His argument throughout the trial was that Smiljanska was guilty of something, just not vehicular homicide, that her actions constituted the traffic misdemeanor of careless driving, a fundamentally different legal category with dramatically different consequences. But as the week of testimony unfolded, much of what emerged worked against that narrower framing. Central to the prosecution's case was the question of alcohol, how much Smiljanska had consumed, and when, in the hours leading up to the crash. Because no blood alcohol test had ever been administered at the scene, despite her own admission to officers that she had been drinking, prosecutors were forced to reconstruct the picture through witness testimony, rather than toxicology. What that testimony revealed, according to multiple outlets covering the proceedings, was a pattern of shifting and inconsistent statements from Smiljanska in the aftermath of the crash about how much alcohol she had consumed, about when she had consumed it, about the timing of prescription medication she had taken, and about her own account to police and investigators in the days that followed. Magnus's father, Michael White, would later describe this pattern bluntly in his public remarks after the verdict, saying she had misrepresented the truth to investigators at multiple points across the case. Also unraveling during the trial was the previously circulated claim that Smiljanska was a Ukrainian refugee, a detail that had shaped early public sympathy and media framing of the case, but that was directly contradicted by facts established in court. Alongside it, the defense's alternative explanation for the crash, a steering malfunction, first raised publicly in the months after her arrest, received scrutiny it could not withstand under the weight of the evidence presented. By the time closing arguments concluded on the trial's fifth day, Friday, April 4th, 2025, the jury was left to weigh a case that had, over the course of a week, moved decisively away from the narrative of an unavoidable accident and towards something the prosecution had been arguing from the very beginning, that this had been preventable, and that the person behind the wheel bore responsibility for it. The jury began deliberating Friday afternoon, April 4th, 2025, after closing statements concluded. For nearly 7 hours, 12 jurors sat with the full weight of the case, the testimony, the inconsistencies, the competing narratives of recklessness and accident, working toward a decision that would either validate or dismantle almost 2 years of the White family's public fight for accountability. At 10 p.m., Mountain Daylight Time, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Guilty. Guilty of reckless vehicular homicide. Guilty of reckless driving. After 20 months of investigation, delay, and uncertainty. A Boulder County jury had formally determined that Yeva Smiljanska's conduct behind the wheel on July 29, 2023, was not a blameless accident, but a reckless act that killed a 17-year-old boy on his way to represent his country at a world championship. Outside the courthouse, Michael White offered a statement that would be repeated in headlines across the country. It was a crime, not an accident, not an unfortunate confluence of circumstance. A crime with a victim, and now, finally, a legal finding of responsibility attached to it. Jill White's reaction carried a more complicated weight. Relief mixed with an exhaustion that nearly 2 years of waiting had etched into every public statement the family made. She called the verdict a small step forward for accountability, but was careful, even in that moment of vindication, to note that whatever sentence Smiljanska ultimately received would not be enough to answer for what had been taken from their family. Michael White's remarks after the verdict went further, laying out publicly for the first time in such stark terms the pattern of deception he believed had defined Smiljanska's conduct throughout the investigation. Lies about how much she had had to drink, lies about the timing of that drinking, lies about prescription medication, lies to police, lies to investigators. He noted pointedly that she had shown no remorse and taken no responsibility until she was compelled to take the stand in her own trial, 615 days, by his count, after she killed Magnus. Even in victory, the family's statement carried an edge of unresolved anger, directed not at the jury or the verdict, but at the process that had preceded it. They expressed open disappointment with how the initial crash investigation had been conducted, describing it as a systemic failure on the part of the officials responsible for handling the case from its earliest hours. A direct reference to the missing blood alcohol test that had haunted the case since July 2023, and that had forced prosecutors to build their case on testimony and circumstance rather than hard toxicological evidence. The Boulder County District Attorney's Office, for its part, characterized the outcome as a hard-won success achieved in spite of, not because of, how the initial investigation had unfolded, crediting prosecutors with recovering a case that had been weakened at its foundation by law enforcement's early missteps. With the guilty verdict secured, the case moved to its final phase, sentencing, scheduled for June 13, 2025, where the question was no longer whether Smiljanska was responsible for Magnus White's death, but how the state of Colorado would measure the cost of that responsibility in years behind bars. On Friday, June 13, 2025, nearly 2 years to the summer since Magnus White was killed, Yeva Smiljanska returned to the Boulder County Courthouse to learn her sentence. The hearing stretched over 2 hours, filled with witness testimony that included wrenching, tear-filled statements from both Michael and Jill White, who spoke directly to the court about the specific, irreplaceable weight of losing their son. Smiljanska's own mother, Alexandra, addressed the judge as well, speaking partly in English and partly through a Russian interpreter, pleading for the court to see her daughter as something other than the sum of the crash. She described a calm, quiet child who had never even cried at birth, and testified that her daughter had become suicidal in the aftermath of Magnus's death. A mother fighting, in her words, for her daughter's life as much as for a lighter sentence. Judge Dea Marie Lindsay ultimately sentenced Smiljanska to 4 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections on the count of reckless vehicular homicide, a term within the 2 to 6 year range the felony carried, but one that fell short of what the White family had hoped for, as Smiljanska was taken into custody following the hearing. The moment closed one chapter of a legal process that had consumed nearly 2 years, even as it opened another, the long process of serving that sentence and the family's ongoing effort to see it fully carried out. That effort continued well past sentencing. In November 2025, the White family learned that Smiljanska was being considered for early placement in a community corrections program, a halfway house arrangement that could have eventually allowed her to serve part of her sentence under electronic monitoring rather than behind bars. The family submitted a formal victim impact statement opposing the move. By February 2026, Axios Boulder confirmed that the Boulder County District Attorney's Office had rejected her application for that early release, meaning Smiljanska would continue serving her full sentence in custody. Under Colorado's sentencing structure, she is not eligible for parole until April 2027, with a mandatory release date set for April 2029. Alongside the criminal case, the civil wrongful death lawsuit the White family filed against Smiljanska has continued to move through the courts, a separate track of accountability the family pursued from early on, understanding that a criminal sentence, however significant, would never fully capture everything their son's death had cost them. 3 years on from that July morning on Highway 119, the full truth of what happened to Magnus White is no longer a matter of speculation, rumor, or competing early narratives about refugee status and mechanical failure. It has been established, tested, and confirmed through a jury trial. A young woman drove while impaired and fatigued, drifted from her lane, and killed a 17-year-old who was doing everything right, training legally, wearing his helmet, riding on the shoulder where he belonged, 72 hours from representing his country on the world stage. But the story of Magnus White was never only the story of how he died. It is just as much the story of a 2-year-old on a strider bike who refused to be caught, of a 10-year-old racing against kids years older than him, of a national champion who planned to graduate high school early so he could chase 2 dreams instead of 1, of a family who turned unbearable grief into a nonprofit, a legislative campaign, and a demand that no other rider's family have to walk the road they walked. The White Line continues its work today, pushing for the physical separation of cyclists from traffic, for tougher vehicular homicide penalties in Colorado, and for emergency braking technology that can see a cyclist before it's too late. Every rider who takes part in the memorial rides held in Magnus's name each summer, thousands of them, tracing the same roads he once trained on, carries a piece of that mission forward. "We ride for Magnus," USA Cycling said, in the first hours after his death. 3 years later, an entire community, a legal system, and a grieving family that refused to stay silent have made sure that promise was kept, not only in memory, but in the pursuit of a truth that took 3 long years to fully come to light.